Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Stillman here, and today we are gathered to talk about chronic fatigue syndrome, searching for answers, uncovering solutions. What is this video about? Chronic fatigue syndrome is, I think, one of the most misunderstood and honestly abused um, diagnoses out there in practice. And I'm going to talk today about why there's so much noise, confusion, and controversy about what, from my perspective, is a very simple problem, which is you are tired. Now, that statement may upset some people who've got chronic fatigue syndrome who've been told that their syndrome is very complex. I think that it's very important to understand that incompetent people have a tendency to complicate things that are simple. I focus on simple, practical solutions for people who I am coaching or doctoring, whether they're in my coaching practice or my medical practice. Speaking of which, if you have not subscribed to my blog, it's stillmanmd.substack.com. You get notifications if you're subscribed there to any new video that gets released in my Monday masterclasses, which this is one of. These Monday masterclasses go out to the whole list. You don't have to pay anything. You do get access to a Q&A with me after the masterclass via Zoom link if you're interested. We are also enrolling people at a special introductory price in our Fundamentals of Wellness coaching program, where you will get weekly calls with me and or Jim Laird, who is my strength and conditioning and health coach, where we will teach you all the things that I'm going to talk about in this video, and basically we're going to break down what you need to do in order to be as healthy and well as possible. And on that note, I want to explain one of the big reasons behind why people get caught up in and confused about diagnoses like chronic fatigue syndrome. One of the things I recommend to people is don't focus on your illness, focus on your wellness. One of the things you'll see in the health and wellness literature is that great physicians have always noted that when you get people into the right diet and lifestyle and exercise routine, they are going to naturally heal. And this is because the body is really the engine that fixes itself. So people are going to run around and they're going to say, well, I've got this syndrome and this disorder. I need this, I need that. And the other thing this creates is this mindset of, well, I have this problem and the solution is this. Whether it's like I have high blood pressure, so I got to take a high blood pressure medicine, or I've got fatigue, so I got to take an energy medicine. And this gets into the whole world of natural and integrative herbal nutritional boosters, supplements, whatever. And that's really a myopic and a very short-sighted and a very inadequate view of the complexity that you are. You're incredibly complex, wonderfully, beautifully made, and it's actually relatively simple to understand some of the key factors that are creating problems for people who have fatigue. And for the record, I don't care if this is fatigue, just fatigue, period, or if it's chronic fatigue syndrome. And we're going to talk about why there's so much confusion about all this stuff as we go. So without further ado, let's get into it. So first paper today, this is one of these papers that is a great example of why people get hung up and confused. The chronic fatigue syndrome, a comprehensive approach to its definition and study. Honestly, I think you could read most of this paper and not take away anything meaningful about how to actually help people have more energy and get over their problems because of the mindset of the clinicians writing it and the fact that they don't understand how to get people well. They only know how to kind of nitpick and split hairs and study things to death. So there's two things, though, that I do want to point out in this paper. The chronic fatigue syndrome is a clinically defined condition characterized by severe debilitating fatigue and a combination of symptoms that prominently features self-reported impairments in concentration and short-term memory, sleep disturbances, and musculoskeletal pain. Now, any general clinician can tell you that the average person who's got fatigue has also got potentially problems with things they call brain fog, lack of concentration, distractibility, stress, lack of concentration, short-term memory impairment, poor sleep, and potentially chronic pain somewhere. Diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome can be made only after other potential causes have been excluded. There are no pathognomonic signs or diagnostic tests that have been validated in scientific studies, and no definitive treatments for it exist. This diagnosis to me is basically a ghost. It's people who've got severe fatigue and then a bunch of other sort of garbage bin problems. And when I say garbage bin, I mean that they just get thrown in there. Oh, well, these people have all of the same problem. We're just going to lump them into the same garbage bin diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, although they may have radically different pathophysiological processes and problems contributing to that. This is a very big problem. So 24% of the general adult population has had fatigue lasting 2 weeks or longer. This is not a recent paper. This was just the top one that I could find. This was 1994. Believe me when I tell you these numbers have gotten worse. So fatigue is probably the number one complaint that I get from my patients and or clients in the coaching programs. And I'm going to tell you that it is also probably the single biggest thing that I look to see improvement in, because your fatigue, your subjective rating of how much energy you have is, in my mind, probably the best metric of whether or not I'm making progress or we're making progress in your case, period. So most people have had fatigue. 59 to 64% of those people report that their fatigue has no medical cause. 24% of patients in primary care clinics reported having prolonged fatigue greater than a month. In many persons with prolonged fatigue, it persists beyond 6 months. I see this all the time. Believe me, since 1994, these numbers have gotten much, much, much worse. Okay. One of the things that will happen to people who fall down the rabbit hole of Googling their symptoms and their diseases and trying to figure out what's going on from reading the scientific literature or popular press pieces on the scientific literature is that they're going to start to find out that this has something to do with their hormones. And the hormones are part of the process, but they're not the underlying physiological drivers of basically anything. You have to remember that hormones are created by the body in response to stimuli. Okay. And there's, to a certain extent, they're produced no matter what you're going to do. You basically, it's very hard to truly run out of hormones. You got to work real hard at that. I know this by having measured many, many, many hormone levels. But small variations, small differences, a 10, 20, 30% difference can have a massive impact on how you feel. Now, the other caveat to this is that you are going to find people who've got the exact same hormone levels who have very severe, one of whom has severe debilitating symptoms and the other one doesn't. And you treat one with hormones and they get better, and the other one never had the symptom in the first place. Testosterone is a great example of this. You'll see men who've got basement levels of testosterone and they say, I feel fine. And they have absolutely no symptoms of hypotestosteronism. We may suspect that some of these men just don't perceive their symptoms, as in they've gotten used to them. And then you boost their testosterone if they're interested. And we offer this at my practice if you're concerned and you're a gentleman who needs this care. You boost their testosterone levels and they're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea how tired I was, how much brain fog I had, how miserable I was feeling, how little I felt like taking my wife into the bedroom, whatever it may be. You'll also get men who have, or people in general, who have, let's say, low levels of hormones, and you give them a supplemental hormone and they say, I really didn't see a difference with that. Well, what should I have looked for? It's very interesting how these hormones work. And the way I think about it is they're like light switches. Light switches don't cause light, but they're an essential ingredient in turning the lights on in a room, right? You have to have power in the grid. You have to have a functional electrical circuit. The circuits have got to be on at the breaker box and on and on and on. All these different things have to be in place in order for light to come on when you switch the light switch, right? That means that hormones are important to any illness, and particularly anyone struggling with fatigue. And this is why I'll check a full hormone panel in anyone who's got severe fatigue. And I'm more serious about this the worse and worse the fatigue is. But anyway, this is another example of where people will get kind of wrapped around the axle and not really sure what to make of the whole hormone component of their fatigue and their problem, right? So most studied in chronic fatigue syndrome has been the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Although the quality of many studies is poor, the overall balance of evidence points to reduced cortisol output in at least some patients, with some evidence that this is linked to symptom production or persistence. It seems likely that HPA axis disturbance is heterogeneous and multifactorial in etiology in CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome. Translation: there seems to be reduced cortisol output in these patients, but it's not consistent enough for us to blame the low cortisol for their fatigue. It seems likely that the HPA axis disturbance is heterogeneous and multifactorial. Translation: there's a lot going on here, and obviously a lot of different factors are impacting the pathogenesis of this disease. If it was a purely hormonally mediated disease, like, say, low testosteronism, you would be seeing a lot more people showing up in medical practices asking for hydrocortisone at low doses for replacement of their adrenal hormones. You can get a lot of people better and make them feel better with low dose hydrocortisone or adrenal extracts or something that boosts adrenal activity. But I have to warn you against this because it can be a very bad strategy. Why can it be a bad strategy? Because these hormones are supposed to be produced by your body. And the most important question to ask when a hormone is low is not how do I get more of it? It's why did I run it into the basement in the first place? And even if it's not in the basement, you'll see big shifts in symptomatology with 5, 10, 15, 20% differences in hormone levels, as I mentioned before. So this has a lot to do with chronic fatigue syndrome. I want to explain part of why in some of the coming papers. But before I get into that, one of the other things you're going to see, and I'm not going to say the name of this thing, the thing that shall not be named, because I like being on legacy media, social media sites, and they really smack us pretty hard with the censorship stick when we make content that doesn't exactly fit the narrative, which is pretty narrow if you hadn't noticed. On that note, make sure you're on our email list at stillmanwellness.com. Make sure you're on my Substack, which is stillmanmd.substack.com, so that if we do get deplatformed, censored, crushed in the algorithm, etc., you'll still get notifications from us and you won't lose touch with us because we are here to serve you and help you live your best life. So one of the things you're going to see in the literature is that people are always talking about with something like chronic fatigue syndrome, its link to acute illnesses. Name any acute illnesses mediated by any kind of infectious so-called pathogen, right? They're going to say, oh, well, this is a sequelae of that. I think that's a very, very just this really confuses people because people then get into the mindset of thinking the cold or flu that I had last month caused my chronic fatigue. No, sorry, that's not what happened. Here's what happened. Your body was run down by a variety of things that you were doing. It was somehow malnourished or loaded with toxins and under massive amounts of stress. And so when you got an acute illness, whatever the cause of that illness may have been, when you got that acute illness, you did not have the resources necessary in order to respond to it and overcome the insult. And that left you feeling tired because you didn't have the resources necessary to respond to and overcome that. One of the hallmarks of chronic fatigue is inflammation. This is actually inherent in the old name for chronic fatigue syndrome. It may not be the old name, but it's one of the names for it. They also call chronic fatigue syndrome myalgic encephalomyelitis. Myalgic encephalomyelitis. It's characterized typically by some amount of musculoskeletal pain plus inflammation of the nervous system and musculature. And I won't get any more into the details of that because it's academic. But you'll see this, right? And it's because academics write these papers that lead people to think that illnesses come in from outside their body, right? Let's remember the founder of medicine in the West, Hippocrates, said the illnesses do not come upon us out of the blue. They are the result of small daily sins against nature. When enough sins have accumulated, illnesses will suddenly appear. That's how it really works on a fundamental level. So figuring out what you're doing wrong is the name of the game. So acute illness phases are usually 2 to 3 weeks, but you get these long-term courses of illness with lots and lots of fatigue as a common symptom, but also dyspnea, myalgia, exercise intolerance, sleep disturbance, difficulty concentrating, anxiety, fever, headache, malaise, and vertigo. Okay. I got to tell you, the more people with these problems that I see, the more I see them chasing the next supplement, the next biohack, the next, magical mystical diet. Sometimes this works. You'll get people who say, yeah, you know what? I went carnivore and all of a sudden all my fatigue went away. Or, oh my gosh, I went vegan or vegetarian or some, flavor of those things because there's so many different ways to eat those diets, right? And all of a sudden my fatigue went away. Or, oh my gosh, I started doing this or doing that or whatever. And so, yes, there's a role for putting together, 1, 2, 3 things at a time. But I got to tell you, you got to look at the whole system and the whole picture to get the best outcomes, which is really what I fundamentally want to help people to do. Okay. So the reason I want to really make this point that is so important for you all to understand is that people are always going to be saying we've got this new like long insert acute illness here, right? And then, oh well, this causes that. It's very, very, very myopic. People get stuck in this thinking and they chase this illness and the diagnosis, and they go to these specialty clinics where all they do is this one diagnosis. I see them getting, to be honest with you, bad results over and over and over again, wasting tons of time and money. It's much better to focus on your wellness. Much better. Okay. All right. Another thing that I want you all to know about is that what you'll see when you look into the basic science literature on this is that there's a lot of attention being paid to redox. Redox has to do with mitochondrial function and cellular bioenergetics, not to put too fine a point on it. Okay. And they'll point out that all these people with all these problems, right? They tend to have redox imbalances, systemic inflammation and neuroinflammation, and an impaired ability to generate adenosine triphosphate, that's ATP, and a general hypometabolic state. What does that mean? It means their mitochondria don't work well, they can't make energy, their cells are tired, and so they feel tired. Okay. And we're going to get into why I think, or some of the big causes that I see contributing to this that I work with people on first whenever they present with fatigue. They also note something that I think is important, but that only most people wouldn't be able to understand the real practical applications of without a little bit of translation. They examine the bi-directional relationship between redox imbalance, inflammation, energy, metabolic deficits, and a hypometabolic state. All of these different buzzwords all come back to the same fundamental principles. And what you're going to see is that any problem with these things, such as if you have a redox imbalance, you'll see inflammation, you'll see energy metabolic deficits, you'll see a hypometabolic state. If you create a lot of inflammation for long enough at a great enough degree, you're going to see redox imbalances occur. You're going to see energy metabolic deficits emerge. You're going to see a hypometabolic state develop. So these are all different faces of the same problem, so to speak. All right. Circadian rhythm disruption in myalgic encephalomyelitis and chronic fatigue syndrome, implications for post-acute sequelae of thing that must not be named. So this is a classic example of a paper that gets put out and confuses people about what's going on and doesn't help them understand what's going on, and also gives them the impression that something that's critically important isn't important. So the whole point of this paper is basically to say that circadian rhythm disruption, and this is where they create a lot of problems, is they'll say things like, while these studies of circadian rhythms have been pursued for decades, evidence linking circadian rhythms to myalgic encephalomyelitis and chronic fatigue syndrome remains inconclusive. A major limitation of older studies of this was the unavailability of modern molecular methods to study circadian rhythms and incomplete understanding of circadian rhythms outside the brain and peripheral organ systems. This would lead the average person to believe that light and circadian rhythms are not going to help them have greater energy. I have to tell you, as a clinician who constantly pounds the table about getting more light during the day and limiting artificial light at night, that the number one thing that people who fix their circadian rhythms tell me has happened to them is that they have more energy. But academics like this guy put out stuff like this that lead people to think, oh, because what happens is this gets picked up in the mainstream news and they'll say something in a headline like major study finds or new papers, finds, poor link between circadian rhythms and chronic fatigue syndrome. I don't think this is fair at all. I got to tell you, and you're going to hear this from other people. People are going to say this doesn't matter. Light doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much time you spend outside, or you're going to get terrible advice from the dermatologists who are going to say things like, there's no such thing as a healthy tan, and then you look at the actual data and it turns out that all-cause mortality is reduced by things like sunbathing, right? How can there be no such thing as a healthy tan if the healthy tan reduces your risk of death? Riddle me that, Mr. Dermatologist. So anyway, this kind of stuff really grinds my gears. We have to kind of deprogram patients and clients who come into programs with us from this kind of thinking because they've heard this over and over again. The other thing this does is it pushes them into thinking, oh, well, if it's not about light and circadian rhythms, it must be about, I don't know, caffeine or taurine or, nitric oxide or some other buzzword that they're being sold supplements or energy drinks or other products to improve. And while there's a place for products, I'm going to talk about some of the ones I use for fatigue later. There's no substitute for getting people out into nature, getting them an abundance of sunlight, getting them and their circadian rhythms back on track. And this is why, for me, blue blockers are amazing. Red and infrared light therapy, sauna can be amazing. You'll see massive improvements in people's energy levels. I've got 2 great Substack articles on that. Substack articles that you can find by putting in blue blockers or red and infrared light therapy or sauna therapy. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, one really big clue that light is a big deal for fatigue. I mean, one really big clue. I'm picking one paper. The reality is you all see this every single day. When do you wake up? You wake up in the morning naturally when light comes back into the environment, right? And when do you naturally go to bed if you don't have any artificial light? When the sun disappears from the environment. What happens when you stay up late or you're a shift worker and you work all night? You get more tired. How about that, right? What happens when you don't get enough sleep to compensate for that? You feel even more tired, right? I mean, this stuff is like so elementary, so obvious that you would think it would be obvious to clinicians to look at this kind of thing. And you would think it would be obvious to scientific researchers to not do papers or write reviews where they're like, the evidence is inconclusive, but where they actually take real people, they put them out into the sunlight and they say, hey, did you get more energy? Yeah, turns out they do. Maybe it's too elementary for them to study, but anyway, short-term night shift working mimics the pituitary adrenocortical dysfunction in chronic fatigue syndrome. So this paper is very simple. They took some shift workers, they looked at some metrics of hypothalamic pituitary function, and they found, lo and behold, that when you switch into a shift working mode, you are going to look like you have chronic fatigue syndrome from the perspective of your hormones. This is a really big clue that everyone should pay very close attention to. This is why shift work in general is associated with an increased risk of death. It's associated with an increased risk of cancer, heart disease. I mean, working the night shift is one of the worst things you can do for your health. And that's not controversial. It's not just Dr. Stillman says. This is very well established in the literature. So how you can make papers out there that are like circadian rhythms don't matter, we don't know what causes this. Give me a break. Look at the literature. People who work at night are more tired. People who work at night have more inflammation. People who work at night die younger. Hello? Working at night is bad for you. The sun reduces all-cause mortality. I talk about that all the time. If you want more on that, go watch my masterclass called How I Use UVB Light to Heal. That's why people get more energy when they go outside, right? So all of this really grinds my gears, and it leads to patients being confused about what they should do, why they should do it, how they should do it, and so on and so forth. Here's another paper, not to beat this horse to death, where they talk about a lack of seasonal variation of symptoms in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. And they basically say there's no seasonal variation in how these people feel. And they say patients with CFS exhibit an abnormally reduced seasonal variation in mood and behavior and would not be expected to benefit from light therapy. Hold on. Wait a minute. What they don't talk about in this paper, from what I could tell, and maybe I missed it. If I did, let me know. But what they don't talk about in this paper is figuring out what these people's light environments were like. In my practice, I have patients who are foresters out there walking through woods with abundant sunlight, natural light all day. I also have people who are doing desk jobs in windowless offices. Those couldn't be more different light environments. If you don't know, and this is why the academics get so confused, they don't know simple things. You have to figure out how much light your patients or study subjects are getting if you're going to make a comment on something like seasonal variation of symptoms. And that's why you will be confused if you try and figure out, should we use light therapy in these people or those people? Oh, we don't know. There's no conclusive evidence that circadian rhythms play a role in chronic fatigue syndrome. Well, did you check and see how much light these people got? Because that's the number one timekeeper for your circadian rhythms. And it was very hard to find smart papers on this for this presentation. which is why I've basically just trotted out a bunch of papers that I think were an absolute waste of time and probably money that went into paying the salaries of the people who wrote them. And it pains me to say that as somebody who cares about science and the scientific method and knowledge. But honestly, I mean, I'm just a general internist, and I feel like I have a more sophisticated understanding of these mechanisms and actually how to help people with this information than the people who are making these studies. All right, enough of that. Talk about vitamin and mineral status and chronic fatigue, because this is where there's a lot of controversy. So one of the things you're going to see is papers like this one where they say, we weren't able to find any association between a clear association between nutritional levels and chronic fatigue syndrome. This again is one of those types of papers that leads people to believe, oh, there's nothing for me to do about my nutrition in order to improve my energy. But over and over again, I see overwhelmingly that when you get people on the right nutritional supplementational protocol for them, their energy levels improve. And the problem with this and the way that these studies are done is they'll do this systemic review and meta-analysis where they'll lump all the papers together, no matter how poorly they were designed. And poor study design in nutrition is rampant. And when I say poor study design, I mean that what they're doing in the studies has absolutely nothing to do with what happens in the real world. And that's why when people say there's no evidence that it helps, I look at them and I think, you really haven't studied a specific method in enough detail to actually judge it. So you shouldn't be saying that. And the reality is no one wants to study this stuff because none of it can be patented. And that's very important for you to know as the consumer, because anyone who's trying to lead you down a trail of therapy or therapeutic choices, where to spend your money, where to spend your time, who's saying there's not enough evidence, well, who's paying their salary? The people who denigrate integrative, functional, holistic, natural, whatever you want to call it, medicine, they're making absolute fortunes off of the chronic disease of modern Americans. And they seem very content with that status quo because they all keep showing up to work and they all keep, cashing their paychecks at the end of the month. And then they make a big show sometimes about wanting to change the system, and then they don't. So anyway, all right. Serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels in chronic fatigue syndrome, a retrospective survey. So this was actually a fun paper to read, and I liked this one. So 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels are moderately to severely suboptimal in chronic fatigue syndrome patients. Why is this a really big deal? You remember how I was talking about circadian rhythms, how these people are like, oh, they don't play a role, right? What does 25-hydroxy vitamin D tell you about that person? The people who tend to have higher levels tend to spend more time outside. I would bet you that if you did a survey of light exposure and time outside, and particularly time outside during UV intense portions of the day in chronic fatigue syndrome patients, you would find a very strong association between these chronic fatiguers and time spent indoors. In other words, I strongly suspect that these people, a big part of their problem is our modern indoor lifestyle. In my anecdotal experience, one of the biggest reasons that people today are tired is that they spend almost all of their time inside. And even 3 10-minute walks a day can make an enormous difference in how much energy they have because it allows their circadian rhythms to be much better timed. Now, vitamin D levels are not just about sun exposure, which is one of the big confounding variables that you might point out as a limitation of this study. Likewise, giving people vitamin D levels or vitamin D supplements hasn't been shown to have the same benefit as sun exposure. Why is all this so important? It underscores how critical it is for people to actually have coaching on what they need to do to optimize their nutrition, optimize their lifestyle, and optimize their daily routine, which is why we have a course called The Fundamentals of Wellness, which includes a ton of very valuable information, as well as time spent or time where you can actually talk to Gemini and say, hey, here's my situation. Here are my goals as far as my fitness and my wellness. What should I do? And we'll walk you through the critical steps to help you understand how to get where you want to get. So anyway, this is another big clue that sunlight has a lot to do with fatigue, and particularly chronic fatigue. This is another big clue that nutrition is a big deal, even if there's these studies where people are like, it's not that important, right? And that's why I focus on nutrition, anyone, but particularly people who come in with fatigue as a presenting main symptom. So, red blood cell magnesium and chronic fatigue syndrome. This is a very famous paper. It's not famous to you, but it's famous to geeks like me who can't stop reading the literature. This paper was really interesting. They found that people who have low levels of red blood cell magnesium tend to improve their fatigue when they get adequate quantities of their magnesium. Where is there we go. Change in score after treatment. Where are they? Oh, shoot. Um, I can't find it. It's buried in here. People felt better after they took magnesium. This is part of why everyone out there is trying to get you to buy their magnesium supplement. I respect that. It's important to take enough magnesium, but one of the biggest mistakes I see people making is that they take magnesium supplements when they're eating a low magnesium diet. How about that? You get someone on a high magnesium diet and they feel better, and then you can minimize their pill burden and their pill fatigue. And one of the funny things you'll find, and this is anecdotal, you'll never find this in the literature, is that the more supplements you put people on, often the less well the supplements work. And the fewer supplements you put them on, sometimes the more the supplements work. Don't ask me how that works. It's not something I can give you chapter and verse from the scientific literature on, but it is very, very, very true in my experience. And I'm not the only one. Lots of other clinicians I've talked to in my world have seen this as well. So magnesium can be part of the solution for someone's fatigue, but rarely is it the most important thing that they do. It's often something that gives them a little help, kind of a boost, but often you're looking at many, many, many more mineral imbalances on top of copper, or excuse me, magnesium, that are causing this. Okay. One of the reasons why I like to look at minerals, right, is that they're really foundational to our physiology. One of my favorite quotes comes from a guy named what was his name? Henry Schroeder. He was a physician. He said, trace elements are more important than are the vitamins in that they cannot be synthesized by living matter. Thus, they are the basic spark plugs in the chemistry of life on which the exchanges of energy and the combustion of foods and the building of living tissues depend. And that's why, you have to ask the question, right? If there's a benefit to magnesium supplementation in these cases, is there a benefit to other minerals? This is a great little case study where they took a small number of people. They did a before and after questionnaire on how their quality of life, and they found significant improvements in their quality of life for a variety of different metrics with multi-mineral, multivitamin. What was the multi-mineral and the multivitamin? I actually like this. This is a pretty reasonable composition for multi-mineral, multivitamin. I don't say that lightly. I get a lot of products like multis that people are asking me for my advice on, and I don't like most of them. This one's not perfect, believe me. I have problems with this one as well, but it could be a lot worse. And the most important thing is that it doesn't have a bunch of stuff in it that I'm actually really, really concerned about. So why do these numbers work? Without going through all of them in exhausting detail, these are non-trivial quantities of vitamins and minerals. They're not mega doses. You're not going to overdose anyone on these. You're also not going to treat a severe deficiency with any of these. That's very important to note, depending on kind of on who you ask and how you're going to define deficiency. But without a doubt, and this is one thing I'll help people understand, is look at all these numbers. Instead of taking a pill, you can get to most of these numbers, if not all of them, just by changing your diet. Just by changing your diet. And that's really important because I see a lot of people trying to out supplement a bad diet, and that's a bad strategy. I see it failing over and over and over and over again. And that pains me. It pains me to see people putting money into supplements when the real fundamental problem is what they're eating. If you sign up for a course with me, if you get on coaching calls with me, if you go through my materials, you are going to come out with a much better grasp on what to eat and why than practically anyone you'll meet out in the general public, and the vast, vast majority of clinicians who've mostly been brainwashed into bad nutritional paradigms because they don't see enough patients and they don't have an open enough mind. So anyway, minerals play a critical role in metabolism and in energy generation. I'm not surprised this formulation worked for this small group of people. I'm confident it would help a lot of other people. However, caveat, I want you to understand that just because this worked for these people doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody. And that's a really big misconception that people run up against is they say, oh, well, this worked for these people who have the disease that I'm told that I have. Why won't it work for me? You're all different. I sort of say this jokingly, but you're all special. Each of you is as special as a snowflake. You all fall and you all melt in your own special way. But it's true, because I'll get your labs back and none of you are the same. And that means that my nutritional supplementation protocol and specific recommendations as far as very critical foods in your diet are actually going to be different. And many people miss this. So, all right. Uh, oh, yeah. One of the big causes of fatigue that is grossly underappreciated in our modern world is the contribution of heavy metals. So, heavy metals are not well understood in terms of their dynamics by most physicians and the vast majority of physicians, and by the vast majority even of scientists. Really, it takes someone with an understanding of toxicology and environmental health, and environmental medicine to understand this. So heavy metals accumulate in the body over time. And what they tend to do is chronically sap or undermine energy generation within cells and body tissues. And this then creates what we call disease. So when I look at something like mercury toxicity, I'm not talking about the blood level of mercury that other physicians would describe as a toxic level. I'm looking at the tendency for people with higher mercury levels in their body to be sicker, more tired, more fatigued, have more memory impairment, and more depression. And one of the things you'll see over and over again, if you actually take care of real people and put them on nutritional supplementational protocols that actually work, is that levels of heavy metals tend to rise when you put them on the right protocol. This is very true of mercury. I'll see a mercury level in someone's hair triple or quadruple if I get their supplementation and their diet and their lifestyle right. Now, the lifestyle component is very important because it has a lot to do with how your body deals with toxins. But at the end of the day, here's the bottom line. When it comes to toxins, your body's accumulating them. Over time, they create more and more damage. And this means that creating the right circumstances for your body to purge itself of these toxins is critical. And if you don't do that, it's not going to end well. And that's one of the reasons why modern people are so sick. I'm not going to go too much into I'm not going to go into the details of this study, but the bottom line here is a shocking number of people have evidence of mercury toxicity. And there's a lot of debate around what we should define mercury toxicity as. I will tell you that I routinely see higher and higher levels of mercury in people. And often when we get those levels down, they feel much, much, much better. So copper toxicity syndrome. This is a really interesting and also very controversial topic that I'm not going to get too deep into. Clark Engelbert and I did a webinar on this earlier this month. That would have been on the first Thursday of September 2023. If you want to look it up and watch it, I strongly recommend you do. It's very interesting. Copper toxicity overtly is rare, as in you will rarely diagnose someone with toxic levels of copper in their blood. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen anyone. Well, the highest level of copper I think I've ever seen in the serum is like 180, and those people are generally speaking not doing well. But they're also, for the most part, not in the ER dying of acute copper toxicity. But the problem you'll find is that as copper increases in load in the diet or in the environment, because you can get it from copper pipes, it's found in some things like fungicides and pesticides. You can get it from a variety of sources. As it increases in the diet, if there's not an increase in other trace elements to balance it out, like manganese and zinc and chromium and selenium, you'll actually wind up with higher and higher and higher levels of copper in the serum, which are accompanied by worse and worse symptoms. Now, you're not going to find that in the conventional literature. That's all anecdotal. That's what this paper is all about. But it's very consistent in practice. And so when you start to treat people by dropping their copper intake sometimes, eliminating copper supplements, and then increasing their intakes of some of these other minerals like zinc, manganese, molybdenum, chromium, selenium, etc., a lot of their problems improve symptomatically. This is a great document on this. We can link to this somewhere because it's a great paper on this topic, and it really helps spell it out. Not necessarily in the way that a layperson will understand, but for practitioners who want to learn more, this is a great a great thing for you to learn about. What's the real problem with copper? When it builds up and it's free, it actually creates a lot of oxidative stress. If you go into the literature on aging, inflammation, Alzheimer's disease, neurodegeneration, you're actually going to see a lot of papers talking about this. They've only got the tip of the iceberg and they don't have any idea what to do about it in clinical practice. Fortunately, I do, which is why I see patients and why we have coaching programs. We actually help you understand what to do instead of just being, inundated by a constant stream of noise and confusion. But you're starting to see them pay more attention to copper as a cause of disease. And if you look in this literature long enough, you're going to find that there's a couple of themes that are really important to understand. It's not the absolute amount of copper. If anything, intakes of copper have declined. It's the copper in its ratios to other minerals, and it's whether or not the copper is bound by enzymes. And that last piece is really critical. People need to remember that minerals are used by enzymes in order to accomplish their function. When I was in inorganic chemistry class, 17, 18 years ago, I can't believe it's been that long. It's half my life. When I was in inorganic chemistry class, my professor told me that when he was going through his training 30 or 40 years prior, they told him that 10% of all enzymes in the body used minerals. And at the time I was going through training, he said that number is now 40 or 45%. Well, do the math. For all I know, that number is now 60, 65, 70, 75, 80%. I know that when I get patients on the right mineral ratios for them in their diet or supplements or both, I know that when I get more minerals into the diet that they need, I know that people get better. It is overwhelmingly found in my practice. You'll also find this in the literature. This is, again, not just me. If you find people who are eating higher densities of minerals in their diet, more potassium, more magnesium, even things like salt that are often vilified, you'll find that all-cause mortality decreases at a threshold of 2.4 grams. There's a lot more detail there that's needed relative to a low salt diet. So minerals are critical for your well-being, but they have to be bound in enzymes in order to be used. And that is one of the key things that people don't get. Boosting levels of minerals, if they're not going to be utilized in the body, can be a colossal mistake. And that's why it's not uncommon in my practice for me to get people in who are like, look, I'm taking all these supplements. I'm taking particularly beef liver. I'm eating, a diet that's rich in copper or this or that, and I feel worse. What happened? You were pushing minerals into the system that the system couldn't use. And one of the things that causes you to make the proteins that the minerals can be then used by is light. Wow. How about that? How do I know that? Well, this is one of my favorite little hacks or tips or recommendations for people who have fatigue. So, what is GHKCU? GHKCU is a copper peptide that's made by the body, and it is an incredible new anti-aging technology that we can actually manipulate within the body with light. That's what LifeWave patches do. If you don't know what LifeWave patches are, there is a link to them in my bio, my link tree, which should be in the description of this webinar, video, whatever. And if you go to my link tree on any of my social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, wherever it is, you'll find it. And it's just the link tree /StillmanMD. LifeWave patches reflect a specific frequency of light back into the human body that promotes and upregulates production of GHKCU. And what does GHKCU do? It activates and turns on stem cells. What do stem cells do? They help you heal and regenerate and rejuvenate and get better and feel better. That's why everyone and their mother is now going crazy about stem cells. They're flying to Tijuana. They're flying to Panama. They're going to clinics in Florida. They're going to the new anti-aging doc around the block who just started using stem cells last month. Guess what? You don't necessarily, I think that stem cell procedures can be great for the record, but a lot of people are leaving a ton of low-hanging fruit on the tree of stem cell activation and optimization because they're not living in the right light. And, before you go out and buy a $5,000 to $10,000 procedure with stem cells, why would you not get a $100, sleeve of patches of the X39 patch? For people who have fatigue, what I generally recommend to them is that they start with a 3-month supply of the X39 patch because it's the best, most powerful patch that we have. It has the most consistency and it upregulates this peptide, which then turns on wound healing and regeneration and skin remodeling. It has a ton of anti-aging benefits. It's part of why I wear one every single day. I start with 3 months of the X39 and I go from there because there's a lot of other patches like the carnosine patch and the glutathione patch that can really help with this. And if you're ready to go all in, I would add to X39 the Aeon patch, the glutathione patch, and the carnosine patch if you're struggling with fatigue. So the human tripeptide GHKCU and prevention of oxidative stress and degenerative conditions of aging, implications for cognitive health. This is the part I really want to share with you guys. It's really critical to understand. Oxidative stress, disrupted copper homeostasis, and neuroinflammation due to overproduction of pro-inflammatory cytokines are considered leading causative factors in development of age-associated neurodegenerative conditions. ... GHK CU, the peptide upregulated by LifeWave patches, possesses a plethora of other regenerative and protective actions, including antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and wound healing properties. Recent studies revealed its ability to up and down regulate a large number of human genes, including those that are critical for neuronal development and maintenance. We propose GHK tripeptide as a possible therapeutic agent against age-associated neurodegeneration and cognitive decline. Okay, what does that mean? It means that peptides like this can be a critical element or tool in mitigating the damage of modern life that is leading so many people to be incredibly sick and unwell in our modern world. And that's why I use them more and more every day in my practice. Okay. Next up, I would be remiss if I did not mention a really critical component of treatments for fatigue, and that is mind-body medicine. I'm not going to get too deep into this because it's already been 45 minutes and we don't have all that much time. I got to get to my paid subscribers Substack Q&A. If you want access to that, upgrade to the paid version of the Substack and you will get a link with the email that comes out with this video. So mind-body interventions, or MBIs, is what we're looking at in this paper. If you don't know what that is, go to my Substack, look up mind-body medicine. I've got articles on that. So what they found is that fatigue severity, anxiety and depression, and physical and mental functioning were shown to be improved in patients receiving mind-body interventions. There are a lot of challenges or confounders in that result, for the record. But I want to tell you, and the reason I bring this paper up is that the mind-body connection is critical in any illness, and it's extremely critical in chronic fatigue syndrome. I remember this story from Tom Cowan that he told at Wise Traditions last October, almost a year ago now. I can't believe that. Where did the time go? Tom told this story about a patient who said, I have, chronic this syndrome. And he wouldn't stop talking about how it was caused and how he got it and how he's suffering from it and how the symptoms he has. And Tom just said, look, here's your therapy. I want you to go out and I want you to not use any of those words, not speak any of them out loud for the next 3 weeks, and tell me how you're doing. And what this guy found is that he had a massive improvement in his symptoms when he stopped talking about his illness. Your tongue, your words create your world. It's very powerful when you make a statement, what it will do in your brain. And that's why you've got to be really careful about what you say, particularly when it comes to what you say about your health. If you say, I have this, I have that, you're actually making it more problematic. That's why I don't really focus on diagnoses. I don't focus on illness. To take this back to the point I made at the beginning of the webinar, I focus on wellness. I focus on restoring the body to the environment and the lifestyle and the diet that the body needs to have the resources necessary in order to overcome its acute problems and chronic problems and restore healthy metabolism, normal, optimal homeostasis of the body. That's the name of the game when it comes to good medicine, because what is the greatest medicine of all? Hippocrates said the greatest medicine of all is teaching people how not to need it, right? The goal of this webinar is not to teach you to take medicine for the rest of your life or go out and buy a bunch of fancy lab tests. It's to help you understand that your goal should be optimal wellness, and optimal wellness shouldn't require you to take a bunch of things that come in bottles, bags, or boxes. It may, if you've got certain goals, but that's what we get into with coaching and helping you understand. All right, last point today, Really cool paper that I found on this. This is from Medical Hypotheses, one of my favorite journals out there. Do sauna therapy and exercise act by raising the availability of tetrahydrobiopterin? For those of you who don't know, tetrahydrobiopterin is one of the components of the methylation system. And one of the things you'll see when you look at things like sauna and exercise is they upregulate tetrahydrobiopterin and make more of it available. And without getting too deep into the weeds on this, the key point that I want to make here ties back into the supplements and ties back into the light. And it's simply this: the light you're under, the exercise you're doing, the stress you put your body under in the environment is going to change things that are considered to be nutritional. Tetrahydrobiopterin is generally thought of as a biochemical process, but it is impacted by biophysical factors like sauna and exercise, which is why sauna and exercise can be a big, big game changer for people with fatigue, brain fog, any kind of medical problem. It's why sauna is associated with overall longevity and reduced risk of death and disease. It's also why you'll look, by the way, at things like sunlight. This is part of why sunlight is so good for you. It's having effects on all these cascades. So that's it for today. As always, thank you for watching. Make sure to share this with someone who needs it. Like, subscribe. Make sure you head over to my newsletters at Substack and at stillmanwellness.com and sign up for those. And for those of you who are my paid subscribers on Substack, thank you so much for your premium subscription. And I will see you in the Q&A. The link is coming to you in the email with this video that comes out on Substack in a moment. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. Don't forget to get outside.